Captain Elena Vasquez stood at attention, her crisp uniform pressed and boots polished, the only woman in her unit not trying to outshout the rest. While the others filled the barracks with loud jokes and swagger, Elena moved with a quiet precision that never drew attention but never missed a detail. She didn't need to raise her voice to be noticed. Her steady presence spoke for itself. In a world where speed and aggression seemed to earn all the praise, Elena's calm approach made her an outlier. The whispers about her low aggression profile and the constant side glances followed her from briefing rooms to the field. But in just one move, she would shatter every assumption they had about her. When insurgents ambushed their convoy, pinning her squad down under heavy fire, her decisive actions in those critical seconds would define her reputation for years to come. Most days, though, Elena's leadership style set her apart in quieter ways, especially during morning inspections, where her efficiency contrasted with the noise around her. Among the ranks, Elena became known less for her presence and more for how easily she faded into the background, unless someone needed a report fixed or a detail double-checked. The label, "The Forgotten Soldier," followed her quietly, passed from one briefing to the next, never quite spoken aloud but always understood. The mishap that landed her in the 7th Combat Engineers was never corrected. A personnel slip-up, intended for another officer with a similar name, remained unaddressed, partly out of bureaucratic inertia, and partly because no one expected her to make waves. Colonel Meeks barely concealed his skepticism. At her first ops meeting, he thumbed through her file with a frown, pausing on the psychological evaluation. Low confrontation threshold, collaborative decision-making style. The words were circled in red ink, and the logistics officer across the table stifled a laugh. The implication was clear. Elena's approach didn't fit the prevailing idea of what a leader should be. Aggression and speed were prized above all else, and her record full of top scores in marksmanship and endurance never made it to the bulletin board. Instead, a clerk who routinely misplaced her range results managed to circulate her psych report up and down the chain of command. Elena noticed the pattern but said nothing. She discovered altered field exercise reports while sorting supply requests, finding that her own leadership evaluation from a night infiltration drill described her as hesitant under pressure. The original, unsigned carbon copy told a different story. Exceptional situational awareness. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent, each one eroding her standing bit by bit. The only acknowledgement of her abilities came from the armory custodian, a Vietnam veteran who, during a rainy inspection, commented on the spotless condition of her weapon. "Funny how the loudest guys always bring me rust buckets," he said, handing her rifle back with a nod. The battalion psychologist was the first to address the issue directly. During a routine screening, he pointed out the trend he'd seen in her records. "They're weaponizing introspection," he said, sliding a research article across the desk. The study, buried after its first printing, showed that quiet leaders made more accurate decisions in simulated ambushes than their louder peers. Elena tucked the paper into her notebook and left without comment, her reputation unchanged outside the psychologist's office. She kept meticulous notes, logging each instance of altered evaluations and misplaced recommendations. Her name was absent from promotion lists, despite exam scores that placed her at the top of her cohort. When challenged, the battalion clerk shrugged and offered no explanation. The unspoken rule was that Elena was reliable, but not the kind of officer to put forward. Evenings found her in the base library, studying after-action reports and noticing the same pattern. The most effective leaders in the field were rarely the ones who drew the most attention. Rumors spread quickly among the enlisted. Sergeant Ruiz briefed newcomers with a dismissive wave. "Don't bother Vasquez. After 1,600, she's just the adjutant with rank." The perception was persistent, reinforced by promotion boards that valued command presence above all else. Elena's evaluations were filled with the phrase, "always marked as a weakness," and her achievements quietly overlooked. Still, she paid attention to the details others missed. During a late-night shift in the operations center, Elena reviewed a classified report on leadership under fire. The data was clear. Less vocal leaders made fewer fatal errors in the chaos of first contact. The report, stamped and shelved behind outdated field manuals, was labeled "For official use only." A sticky note on the cover read, "Interesting, but not actionable at this time." Elena photographed the pages, adding them to her growing archive. As the next rotation approached, the roster for the upcoming urban assault exercise landed on her desk. She scanned the assignments, noting her own name beside medical officer, a role she'd been given by default thanks to a certification, not by choice. The pattern was familiar, but the stakes were about to change. Elena's assignment as medical officer for the upcoming urban assault exercise came as no surprise. The slot was filled by default, a box checked because she held the right certification, not because anyone expected her to shape the scenario. She unpacked her aid bag in the shadow of a Humvee, while Lieutenant Grayson delivered the standard briefing, his voice rising as he traced lines on a laminated map. He warned of heavy resistance in sectors 2 through 4, but the alleyways he described didn't match the terrain model or the safety brief. Elena noticed the inconsistencies, but nobody asked for her input. Colonel Meeks strode onto the range half an hour before the start, flipping through a new set of scenario sheets. "Change of plans," he announced. "All medical extraction assets are down. If you want your wounded out, you'll have to carry them." The new directive meant casualties would need to be hauled by hand across open ground, an abrupt shift from the usual exercise rules, which required vehicles for severe injuries. The safety officer hesitated, but a cold look from Meeks ended any protest. While the others joked about who would die first, Elena inventoried her supplies by the burn barrels. She found only 9 tourniquets instead of 12, and the chest seals were missing entirely. When she pointed this out, the supply sergeant shrugged. "Budget cuts," he said, not bothering to hide the crates of ammunition stacked nearby. The exercise opened with 3 simulated casualties in the first Minuta textbook ambush, echoing tactics from the unit's last deployment. Grayson's call for medevac returned only static. On the control channel, someone laughed. Grayson froze, helpless, clutching his helmet as the situation spun out of control. Elena acted without waiting for permission. She pulled 2 wounded soldiers behind a wall and triaged them based on the cards she'd memorized. The third, a dummy with a simulated arterial bleed, got a tourniquet from her personal kit. She directed the fire team to cover the northwest alley, her voice steady and direct. The specialist obeyed without hesitation, only realizing afterward that Elena wasn't technically in command. By the time Grayson recovered, Elena had organized litter teams and mapped exfiltration routes with chem lights. She used an admin radio to bypass the jammed tactical net, relaying coordinates straight to the range tower. When Grayson suggested leaving casualties for later extraction, Elena overruled him. No one argued. The after-action report credited Grayson with effective crisis decision-making. The bullet points described Elena's actions, but her name was missing from the summary. The consolidated scorecard circulated through the battalion, and Elena's role disappeared into the background. Weeks later, a routine safety audit turned up the exercise footage. The reviewing major flagged 3 interventions: airway management, casualty collection outside the kill zone, and refusing to split the team that aligned with best practices and would have reduced fatalities by nearly half in real combat. He filed a memo to battalion command, but it vanished into a filing cabinet. A JAG officer uncovered the memo months later, cross-referencing timestamps with Elena's log. The evidence contradicted the official report and reached brigade just as Colonel Meeks submitted another negative evaluation of Elena's leadership. Elena's triage sequence appeared in a medical refresher course as an anonymous case study. The instructor praised the operator's focus, pausing the grainy video while a sergeant whispered, "Bet that's Vasquez." Range control quietly updated doctrine. 2 medical officers per scenario. No last-minute rule changes. All footage preserved. The changes arrived with no names attached. One morning, Elena found a sticky note on her laptop, a hand-drawn caduceus, and the words, "Nice work, Doc." She saved it with the other small record in a system that preferred things lost. Her next assignment listed her as assistant squad leader. The medic designation was crossed out, the paper torn where someone pressed too hard. That evening, Elena added the auditor's findings to her growing archive, careful to document every detail. Even as procedures changed and new policies appeared, Elena saw how recognition could be erased with a misplaced report or a missing signature. Each correction, each quiet shift in protocol, reminded her how easily the truth could be buried. Elena's patience finally wore thin the day her transfer request was denied. The notification came in a plain envelope, the language cold and generic operational continuity requirements. She read it once, then again, searching for any sign her situation had been considered on its own merits. The battalion XO slid the paper across his desk, eyes fixed on his monitor, and Elena saw the coffee ring left behind as a mark of how little the process meant to anyone but her. The new batch of privates learned the unspoken rules quickly. Elena's rank meant little unless another officer was present. In the briefing room, one private mimicked her clipped gestures, drawing quiet laughter until Sergeant Ruiz stepped in. "Heard she's basically a clerk with rank," the private muttered to his bunkmate, not bothering to lower his voice. The message carried. Elena was an outsider, and the unit made sure she knew it. Things escalated on the range during a night qualification. Private Dawes mishandled his weapon during a malfunction drill, finger on the trigger while trying to clear a jam. Elena stepped in, demonstrating the correct procedure, but Dawes dismissed her instructions. "We learned this from real shooters, Ma'am," he said, stubbornly returning to his unsafe grip. When Elena corrected his posture, Dawes shoved her arm away. The tension in the air was immediate and sharp. Colonel Meeks convened a disciplinary hearing the next day. Elena sat across from Dawes, two senior NCOs watching in silence. Dawes claimed she came at him aggressively. The live round that had ejected during the incident sat in an evidence bag on the colonel's desk, ignored. The conversation focused on Elena's supposed confrontational approach, not the safety violation. Her concerns about weapons handling were omitted from the record. The battalion psychologist noticed the change in her demeanor during a routine evaluation. "Flattened affect, reduced verbal output," he typed, glancing at Elena over the edge of his laptop. Standard questions about stress and satisfaction met with short, neutral answers. When he asked about her career, Elena's eyes flicked to a promotion photo on the wall. Colonel Meeks, pinning new rank on Lieutenant Grayson. "It is what it is, sir," she replied. Her journal became more detailed. One page documented the transfer denial, complete with a copy of the brigade's manpower report showing open positions. Another included sworn statements from two range safety officers about the weapons incident, both signed but not notarized. She sketched out the exact sequence of Dawes's improper clearing procedure, marking each safety violation. The Inspector General complaint form waited in her footlocker, half finished. 12 bullet points described the pattern of misconduct, each linked to Army regulations. Elena highlighted the line requiring leaders to correct unsafe practices, regardless of rank. She collected statements, diagrams, and photocopies, building a case piece by piece. Sergeant Ruiz found her late one night, reviewing security footage in the operations center. "They'll say you're obsessed," he warned, watching her note the timestamp of Dawes's mistake. She didn't look up. "Obsession isn't in the UCMJ," she said. The next morning, a memory card holding extra-range footage appeared on her desk. Her first IG complaint went missing in Brigade Legal. Elena hand-delivered the second copy to a JAG office out of town, where a captain stamped the receipt and filed it under a new docket. "Chain of command hates these," the captain said as she made copies. Colonel Meeks called Elena in after the IG acknowledged her complaint. "This is career suicide," he said, tossing the memo aside. Her upcoming promotion board was cancelled, the date circled in red on his desk calendar. Elena stood at parade rest, her eyes on the wall behind him. Her journal filled rapidly pages of documented discrepancies, signed statements, and emails with names redacted. The armory custodian passed her a note during a midnight check, listing former unit members now working at Inspector General offices. Elena added it to her growing file, marking them as potential witnesses. She filed a FOIA request for her performance reviews, requesting expedited processing. At the next formation, Colonel Meeks announced a new policy: 2 officers would now certify all disciplinary paperwork. The timing matched the arrival of Elena's FOIA paperwork at the records office. Privates whispered about a witch hunt, watching as she updated her notebook. The psychologist called her back for another assessment, this time focusing on trust in the institution. Elena's results were bleak, and the doctor shut his laptop with a sigh. "They always shoot the messenger first," he said. By the time the IG investigator arrived, Elena kept 3 binder sewn with originals, 2 backups in separate locations. The system matched Army record keeping, but she added a sticky note inside. For the next one. When the investigator asked about the altered reports, Elena met his gaze. "I file my own paperwork, sir. Always have." The unit's deployment orders arrived soon after, and the routine of the base shifted. Elena packed her files and double-checked her gear, aware that the next assignment would test more than her patience. The border outpost's perimeter fence rattled in the wind as Elena's squad settled in for their first night rotation. Diesel fumes hung over the compound, mixing with dust and the faint chemical tang of ration heaters. Elena moved quietly through the shadows, reviewing the patrol logs while most of the unit focused on unloading crates from the convoy. She noticed a pattern in the sensor alerts 3 nights in a row. The motion detectors along the western gully triggered at nearly the same minute each time. When she pointed it out, the lieutenant brushed her off. "It's just wildlife," he said, his voice echoing against the concrete barriers. "You're seeing problems where there aren't any." On the 4th night, Colonel Meeks cut the guard shifts from 2 hours to 3, citing the need for rested shooters. Elena marked the change in her notebook, along with a running tally of equipment shortages. Night vision batteries were running low, and the supply sergeant had no answer beyond a vague promise of resupply. She walked the fence line alone during her off-watch, flashlight angled low to catch the faint depressions in the dirt. Erosion had carved out new approach routes in the gully, none of which appeared on the official maps. She photographed the tracks, careful not to disturb them, and logged the coordinates. Her request to reposition the sensor array sat unanswered in the operations officer's inbox. Captain Rice dismissed her concerns with a tired wave. "Command's not interested in ghost stories tonight." Elena didn't argue. Instead, she cached spare magazines and medical supplies along the least obvious escape routes, the ones she'd charted after double-checking the terrain. A private saw her stashing gear and smirked, calling her paranoid under his breath. The attack started just after 3 in the morning, minutes outside the usual sensor window. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the generator, plunging the compound into darkness before the sentry could radio for help. Elena, in the latrine reviewing her notes by red light, registered the sequence. Muzzle flashes from the ridge, the emergency frequency silent, wire cutters on the fence. She moved quickly, tracing the route she'd mapped through the compound's blind spots. The armory was already compromised, but she reached her cache behind a collapsed storage shed. 7 soldiers clustered there, some wounded, most unarmed after abandoning their positions in the chaos. She handed out loaded magazines and NVG batteries, her instructions short and precise. Dawes, the private who'd ignored her safety corrections, stared at her. "You planned for this," he said, voice flat. Elena ignored the accusation, signaling the group to move in short, staggered rushes toward the gully. Her notes had marked the best cover and the gaps in the terrain details missed by the official maps. The main road was mined, just as she'd predicted from the disturbed earth and the way the insurgents had skirted the floodplain. Eleanor led the group along a dry creek bed, using hand signals to keep them spaced and quiet. They reached a battered shed she'd marked as a rally point, holding position until dawn. The insurgents combed the compound for intelligence, tossing aside Elena's notebook without noticing the grid coordinates penciled inside the cover. Those same coordinates had guided the survivors away from the kill zone. When medevac arrived, the rescue crew noted the survivors' textbook formation along the riverbed. Eleanor brought up the rear, scanning for movement, erasing tracks as she went. The official investigation later cited protocol violations, Meeks' shift changes, missing equipment, but Elena's sensor logs were gone, the hard drive missing after the raid. The lieutenant, who had dismissed her concerns, submitted a commendation, but it attached to his own file, not hers. Elena updated her notes during recovery, overlaying the insurgents' attack pattern on her earlier sketches. The match was almost perfect. The armory custodian found her cleaning rifles late one night. "Heard your notebook saved lives," he said. Elena replied without looking up. "Notebooks don't save people. Noticing what others miss does." Within weeks, new guidance circulated about analyzing patrol reports and recognizing threat patterns. No credit was given, but every squad leader now carried a notebook. The supply chain found funding for extra batteries. Elena's careful routines, once mocked, became standard practice. As the outpost rebuilt, Elena walked the perimeter at dusk, her attention fixed on the smallest details. The aftermath of the ambush lingered in the compound's silence, broken only by the low hum of generators and the distant sound of boots on gravel. In the gully, smoke still clung to the ground, curling around the blackened wreckage where the fight had started. Elena crouched behind the fractured wall of the depot, her mind already calculating the next move. The choice before her was stark: follow her medical training and stay with Colonel Meeks, or obey the tactical doctrine that demanded she prioritize her own escape and the survival of the rest. Meeks was trapped under a tangle of collapsed antenna supports, his leg twisted beneath him, blood darkening the dirt. He didn't ask for help, not directly, but the silent expectation hung between them. The distant shouts of the insurgent patrol crept closer, their flashlights probing the shadows. She knelt beside him, checking the wound with practiced hands. The shrapnel had torn deep, and the bleeding was steady. Elena's training told her to stabilize, apply a tourniquet, start a pressure bandage, but she knew the risk. Every second spent here increased the odds they'd both be found. She listened for the patrol's location, picking out individual voices and the clatter of gear. Her watch read 347, exactly as her notes predicted. The next shift would rotate through the outpost's eastern sector. The moon was low, and the cloud cover meant the patrol's visibility was poor, a small advantage, but one she had to use. Meeks's hand fumbled for his pistol. "Go," he mouthed, pushing the weapon toward her. His face was pale, sweat beading at his hairline. Elena hesitated, her mind racing through triage priorities and escape doctrine. She remembered the field manual's blunt directive: don't risk multiple lives for one casualty when extraction is uncertain. But she also remembered every denied transfer, every evaluation with his signature on the bottom line. She pressed her carbine under the debris, using it as a lever. The metal groaned but shifted, just enough for Meeks to drag himself free. He gritted his teeth, stifling a cry as his boot left a streak of blood in the dust. The patrol's lights swept closer, beams cutting across the wreckage. Elena tore a page from her notebook, wrapped it around a protein bar wrapper, and tossed it into the rocks. The crinkle echoed, drawing the patrol's attention. She counted silently as they adjusted their search, the leader barking orders to check the ridge. Elena watched the pattern: 3 seconds for the sound to register, 5 for the group to move. She used the chaos to check Meeks's bandage, pressing hard to slow the bleeding. He tried to speak, but only managed a strained whisper. Elena weighed the morphine in her kit, then left it untouched. He'd need his wits if they had any chance of moving. The minutes stretched thin as she listened to the patrol's confusion. She made another noise, a deliberate click of her rifle's safety, and watched as the sound bounced off the walls, sending the searchers in the wrong direction. The delay bought them precious time. She pulled Meeks to his feet, his arms slung over her shoulder, the two of them moving in short, awkward bursts from cover to cover. Elena disguised their trail, scuffing dust over bloodstains, always checking her watch, always listening for the patrol's return. Dawn crept over the horizon as they reached the culvert where she'd hidden a medkit. She worked quickly, starting an IV with the plasma expander she'd packed weeks ago, answering Meeks's unspoken question with a quiet, "Logistics showed the pattern." He managed a faint smile, his strength fading, but his eyes alert. Gunfire cracked in the distance. The patrol had found her decoy. Elena didn't pause. She mapped out their next route, marking the grid in her notebook, and prepared to move again. Meeks leaned against the wall, his breathing shallow but steady. She checked the pressure on his wound, adjusted the sling on her rifle, and listened for the all clear. The choice was never simple, but Elena made it with the same quiet certainty she'd brought to every decision in the field. When they stepped out of the culvert, Elena paused, scanning the terrain for movement. She signaled for silence, her hand raised, eyes on the horizon. Every detail mattered now, every step, every signal, every memory of the ground they'd covered. The team would need her to make the next call. Elena signaled a halt, her left hand raised palm out. 7 figures stopped behind her, boots grinding to a stop on the loose gravel floor of the quarry. She pointed 2 fingers at her eyes, then toward the ridge insurgent scouts had swept across that high ground minutes earlier. The group fanned out, adopting staggered positions without a word. No one needed to speak. Years of drilled hand signals and silent coordination took over where formal hierarchy had broken down. She relied on protocols most of them barely remembered from training hand gestures for advance by bounds, a palm-down sweep to move in short rushes, a tap to the helmet for freeze. When Dawes started to cough, Elena flicked her fingers in the old suppress noise command, a gesture that rarely surfaced outside basic. The squad's silence held as the enemy patrol passed close enough for the sound of shifting gear to echo off the quarry walls. Their escape route ran through mining tunnels Elena had charted during perimeter checks. Her notebook held rough sketches of the passageways, annotated with notes about which routes were stable and which ones flooded after rain. Where others saw only rubble and collapsed timbers, Elena had mapped a network of possible exits. The team moved in single file, hands tracing the walls, relying on her memory and the margin notes she'd updated after every patrol. At the 3rd tunnel junction, Elena signaled another stop. She knelt and scraped aside shale, revealing an ammo crate wrapped in plastic. Inside were fresh batteries for the night vision goggles, water, protein bars, and a trauma kit, each item sealed and labeled. Dawes stared at the supplies, then at Elena, realization dawning. The lieutenant who'd brushed off her routines looked at the dressings and said nothing. Elena distributed the gear with practiced efficiency, already moving on to the next problem. Insurgents blocked the obvious escape routes, setting up positions where anyone would expect a retreat. Elena led them instead through a narrow erosion channel just wide enough for one person at a time, packs held overhead. She'd timed the crossing herself on previous nights, knowing exactly how long it would take to get everyone through. The group emerged behind enemy lines as the first light crept over the ridge. They relied on Elena's supply caches for the next 18 hours. The 2nd cache held a signal mirror and a VS-17 panel, stashed near a rock outcrop she'd marked weeks before. The 3rd provided a hand-crank radio, already tuned to the emergency frequency. Each cache reflected careful planning: water purification tablets for the desert, cold weather gear for higher ground, batteries rotated monthly. Elena's maintenance log-tucked in one catcher-listed expiration dates and equipment checks in neat block letters. Hand signals remained their main form of communication. Elena adapted them as needed, switching from a raised fist to spread fingers when scouts appeared, then to a knife hand, directing movement toward cover. She used ground guides to cross a suspected minefield, 2 soldiers alternating as pointers while the rest stepped in their tracks. The team's discipline, reinforced by Elena's silent commands, kept them moving with minimal risk. At the debrief, the Battalion S3 reviewed the survival rate and asked how they'd managed without resupply. Elena opened her notebook to a page marked Cache Protocols, showing a diagram of the quarry and 6 red X each, a supply point. Her calculations for calorie expenditure and water needs were clear, the details precise. The armory custodian, called in by investigators, produced Elena's range cards and maintenance logs, confirming the same attention to detail in her weapons care as in her cache placements. Later, recruits trained with photocopies of Elena's journal pages. The diagrams of hand signals and terrain sketches became unofficial references, more useful than the standard issue manuals. Squad leaders adopted her system for terrain naming and cache placement. When a training accident stranded a platoon overnight, they found 2 caches within reach, stocked to Elena's specifications. At her promotion ceremony, someone asked how she'd always known where to place the supplies. Elena glanced at her notebook, now stamped as an official reference. "Same way you know where your socks are," she said, "because I put them there." With the team gathered and supplies distributed, Elena studied the battered map and the unfamiliar shapes of the terrain ahead. The next challenge would demand every bit of her preparation and judgment. The extraction began before sunrise, the sky still heavy with mist, as Elena led the group toward the distant ridgeline. The map showed 18 kilometers to the extraction point, but the terrain told a different story-broken shale, gullies choked with brush, and elevation lines that never matched the grid. Elena paused at the edge of a shallow ravine, gauging the time left before daylight would expose them. She looked at the medical litter, where Colonel Meeks drifted in and out of consciousness, and at the 3 wounded being carried by the others. The lieutenant insisted they keep their weapons, his grip white-knuckled on the rifle, but Elena weighed the cost of every extra kilogram. She signaled twice, palms up, fingers splayed, and the team understood. They dropped non-essentials, weapons and ammo stowed under rocks or buried in scree. Only Elena kept her sidearm, hidden beneath the folds of a casualty blanket. The group moved faster with the weight off their backs, crossing ground that would have been impossible with full loads. They kept low, using the uneven terrain for cover. The GPS failed 3 kilometers in, its battery drained to nothing. The lieutenant's frustration threatened to draw attention, but Elena silenced him with a quick hand signal. She checked the sky, searching for the North Star through breaks in the clouds. Years before, her father had drilled her in celestial navigation. Now, those lessons mattered more than any digital map. She adjusted their heading, correcting for the drift caused by the slope, and set a new course 7 degrees east. The ground grew more treacherous as they climbed. A loose patch of shale nearly sent Meeks's litter skidding down a ravine, but Elena wedged it in place with a rock she'd marked on a patrol 2 days earlier. The team's pace slowed, but the formation never broke. When voices echoed in the fog behind them, Elena signaled a halt and waited until the danger passed. Each movement was deliberate, every pause calculated to buy more time. At 543, the faint pulse of the emergency beacon reached them, weaker than expected. Elena scanned the horizon, noting the rally point had shifted about 800 meters south, likely for security. She split the team, redistributing the wounded and taking Meeks's weight herself to free up doors for the last stretch. They crossed a final scree field, just as the first light crept over the ridge. When the medevac crew finally spotted them, the survivors moved in a tight line, exhaustion clear in every step. The lead medic's notes mentioned stable casualties and navigation by stellar reference, a detail that stood out in the after-action review. Elena catalogued what went wrong and what worked. Only 3 supply caches accessed, navigation complicated by cloud cover, not enough litter carry practice among the junior soldiers. She made mental notes for the next time, already thinking in terms of procedures and checklists. The review board focused on her decision to leave weapons behind. A logistics officer calculated their survival odds at less than a quarter, given the loss of firepower. The brigade commander wanted to know why she'd kept only a single pistol. Elena opened her notebook to a page marked with evacuation protocols and cited the regulation that required a sidearm for patient security. The pistol, she noted, was Colonel Meeks properly accounted for during the handover. Her celestial navigation notes became part of the new survival manual, the rough star charts she scratched into her journal, now used to teach degraded environment movement. Dawes, promoted to sergeant, taught land navigation using her watch alignment method. The rifles left behind were recovered weeks later, none fired after they'd been abandoned. The team had moved faster than their pursuers, covering over 4 kilometers an hour with casualties in tow, a statistic now highlighted in SARE training, even if the faces in the photos were generic. At her promotion review, one colonel questioned her judgment. The ranger evaluator slid Elena's notebook across the table, open to her calculations on extraction rates. In the margin she had written, "Speed over firepower when survival is distance." The point required no further debate. Colonel Meeks survived the extraction, but died of infection in the hospital weeks later. His final evaluation praised Elena's leadership in detail, a statement that only entered her record after legal review. The rest of the team recovered, their accounts consistent on one point. Without Elena's planning and navigation, none would have made it out. As the sun rose over the outpost, Elena remained alert to every detail, aware that the work was not finished. The next hours would demand as much from her as the escape itself. After the extraction, Elena Vasquez spent 72 hours in the triage ward. She moved from bed to bed, checking IV bags and adjusting tourniquets, with the same steady focus she'd shown on the range. Nurses recorded her working through 2 shifts without rest, calling out medication dosages and vital signs for 3 patients at once. The head surgeon wrote in his report that some of her methods were unconventional field dressings, adapted from manuals few hospital staff had ever read, but each adjustment matched the demands of the moment. Colonel Meeks's initial debrief barely mentioned her. On paper, she supported casualty evacuation. That changed as survivors submitted their own statements. Dawes, now more subdued, described how Elena had ignored orders to prioritize officers, instead treating the most severely wounded first. The medevac pilot noted how she'd placed strobe lights in the only clear corridor, using wind direction to keep dust away from the landing zone. These small details began to form a picture of consistent, practical leadership, what the awards board would later call sustained situational judgment under pressure. When Pentagon investigators arrived, they found Elena's evidence packet waiting. Inside were terrain sketches dated weeks before the ambush, equipment request forms stamped "denied," and a log of security warnings submitted through official channels. Her notes included direct quotes from briefings, each matched to operational logs. The Inspector General's office confirmed she'd filed 14 formal reports about perimeter vulnerabilities in 6 weeks, all properly routed and ignored. The Distinguished Service Cross recommendation cited 3 decisions: rerouting the squad through the quarry, enforcing noise discipline that kept the group hidden, and using celestial navigation after electronics failed. The board noted she'd kept only Meek's sidearm, in accordance with medical evacuation policy, and referenced her grasp of obscure regulations even under stress. Analysts reconstructed the ambush using her journal and satellite imagery, confirming her predictions about enemy patrols were accurate within minutes. This level of documentation shaped the language in her citation exceptional threat forecasting and crisis response. In the hospital, Elena collapsed near the supply closet after the last patient stabilized. Only then did staff discover untreated shrapnel wounds she'd hidden, to avoid using limited resources. A nurse confiscated her notebook during treatment, finding pages of dosage records and casualty notes that matched official charts almost exactly. Later, the accuracy of her logs became a point of reference for the investigation. The awards process took 6 weeks. Investigators compared witness statements, radio logs, and Elena's own records. Colonel Meeks submitted an amended statement from his hospital bed, crediting her preparations for the unit's survival, though he still described her work as staff diligence rather than leadership. The board struck that line after learning he'd been unconscious during the most critical moments. A JAG officer remarked that Elena's documentation did more to establish the facts than any single testimony. A clerical error almost buried her award paperwork under casualty reports. It was only when a clerk matched her triage notes 11 lives saved, not 7 as the official tally claimed, that the discrepancy triggered a deeper review. 4 additional soldiers had survived because of her interventions before evacuation. The citation was updated to reflect actions beyond immediate operational requirements. At the ceremony, Elena stood in a pressed uniform, the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to her chest. The general's speech focused on quiet professionals who change doctrine through action. The ink stains on her fingers, visible as she accepted the medal, were a silent reminder of the records she kept throughout recovery. Her navigation methods appeared in revised survival manuals. Ranger school instructors began using her cache placement diagrams, and supply requests for backup compasses increased across the brigade. Casualty evacuation slides now included photographs of her improvised litter carry-S images that traced directly back to her field notebook, even if her name was left off the credits. The most lasting changes showed up quietly. Emergency cash stockpiles tripled, all color-coded to her system. Platoon leaders carried updated stellar navigation tables, and her handwritten notes circulated among NCOs. Survival exercise scores rose, though official reports never mentioned why. Eventually, Elena's journal became required reading at West Point, listed only as Historical Case CS 84. Marginal notes especially, document everything. Even minor wins accumulate, were quoted in leadership manuals years later, though never attributed. When the awards board met for final deliberation, one colonel questioned whether a Distinguished Service Cross fit a non-combat action. A senior Marine opened Elena's dossier to a page of pre-attack threat models, noting how her predictions matched the actual ambush. That settled the matter. News of the outcome reached Elena as she reviewed her next set of orders. A new set of orders, stamped and initialed, landed on Elena's desk. The paperwork assigned her to the training command at Fort Liberty, a position she'd once requested with little hope of approval. She packed her records, leaving behind the outpost's battered routines for the uncertainty of a command post where doctrine was often quoted but rarely questioned. The transition felt abrupt. The name on a transfer list, a new office in a building that still smelled of floor wax and old paint. The office was small, tucked away at the end of a hallway with cracked tiles, and a single window overlooking the obstacle course. Elena kept the space sparse: a folding chair, a battered desk, and a dry erase board requisitioned from medical supply, with a regulation citation attached. Her first week, Elena reviewed the existing curriculum. Most lessons followed decades-old outlines, marksmanship scores, timed obstacle runs, rote drills on equipment maintenance. The after-action reports from recent field exercises revealed a pattern. Students excelled under ideal conditions, but faltered when anything went wrong. Elena pulled out her journals, comparing the standard checklists with the notes she'd kept during the ambush and its aftermath. It was clear the current system rewarded the wrong skills. She started with the evaluation rubric. Instead of tracking only range times or target groupings, Elena designed scenarios that forced candidates to adapt under pressure. She introduced weapons malfunctions, simulated comms, failures, and medical shortages into the core of each exercise. The staff bristled at the changes, but Elena pointed to her own record show improvisation and judgment had made the difference between survival and disaster. She replaced PowerPoint lectures with annotated terrain maps and had students walk through decision points based on real-world failures rather than hypothetical threats. The first major test came during night navigation. Elena quietly disabled half the GPS units and handed out her old star charts. Instructors protested, but the results spoke for themselves. Most candidates reached their objectives faster than previous classes who relied solely on technology. Elena documented each outcome, adding notes on which students improvised and which froze when the plan broke down. Her reforms extended to stress testing. She scheduled endurance drills at 300, flooded training lanes during the rainy season, and required candidates to manage triage under simulated fire. The failure rate rose sharply. Complaints followed. Some students argued the standards were unfair. Some staff officers sent memos up the chain. Elena compiled after-action data from historical incidents, showing that rigid adherence to doctrine had repeatedly led to avoidable losses. She included performance records from her own unit, highlighting how those dismissed as average under old metrics had excelled in crisis. The paperwork from Colonel Meek's discharge lingered in the background. Investigators uncovered years of neglected safety protocols and a pattern of rewarding aggression over caution. Elena kept his separation order and her own command assignment in a single frame behind her desk. The symbolism wasn't lost on the instructors who'd served under both leaders. Procurement became another front. Supply sergeants resisted her requests for non-standard items: extra medical kits, backup compasses, specialty batteries. Elena responded with documentation, referencing obscure logistics regulations and demonstrating how improvised gear had outperformed standard issue equipment in the field. The new items appeared on packing lists within weeks. As the new curriculum took hold, outside units began to notice. An infantry brigade adopted her stress-based evaluation after a training ambush exposed gaps in their own approach. Their after-action report credited Elena's methods with reducing casualties and improving decision-making under pressure. The validation was quiet but unmistakable. Graduation statistics shifted. Academic test scores dropped, but field performance in stress drills set new records. Elena posted both sets of data on the bulletin board, labeling them simply, "What actually matters?" The message was clear to anyone willing to look past tradition. With each cycle, Elena refined her approach. She added scenario questions to the instructor certification exam, basing them on events from her own experience: terrain analysis under fatigue, casualty triage on the move, and the challenge of verifying incomplete or doctored information. The instructors adapted, and so did the students. By the time her methods started appearing in lesson plans at other bases, Elena was already focused on the next round of changes. The real test, she knew, would be whether these protocols could survive beyond her own command. The updated evaluation packets arrived with little notice. Just a few new pages slipped into the binders alongside training schedules and safety briefs. The shift was quiet, but the impact was about to spread. The protocol changes at Fort Liberty emerged quietly, but their substance transformed the core of the training program. The new directives came as a slim packet, 3 pages, tucked between range schedules and safety memos. Most instructors skimmed past the first paragraph, not realizing that the evaluation system had shifted from a checklist of technical skills to a layered assessment of judgment under pressure. Where previous drills measured speed and controlled accuracy in daylight conditions, the revised standards placed candidates under continuous stress. Leadership assessments now took place at the 18th hour of operations, with each participant making tactical decisions while carrying a 45-pound pack and navigating unfamiliar terrain. The first group to encounter the new protocols expected routine land navigation. Instead, they entered the woods after a night infiltration, only to discover that maps would be withheld until the exercise was already underway. Compasses arrived with misaligned needles, and grid coordinates were incomplete. Halfway through, instructors activated electromagnetic pulse simulators that disabled all digital gear. The result was a pass rate of just 42%. The failures, however, revealed an important pattern. Those who adapted and succeeded shared a knack for terrain association and improvising solutions. Elena tracked these trends in a spreadsheet that soon became required reading at leadership briefings. Her evaluation metrics focused on how decision quality eroded under fatigue. Written exams no longer took place in classrooms, but after field exercises, when hands shook and minds wandered. Elena documented changes in handwriting, response times, and the frequency of answer revisions. The data showed that most critical errors clustered between 3 and 5 in the morning, mirroring the window when her own unit had been ambushed. This directly challenged the Army's usual practice of testing in the late morning, when candidates were at their best. Pushback surfaced almost immediately. In staff meetings, an operations major argued that the stress scenarios wasted resources. Elena countered with helmet camera footage from her deployment, the moment when exhausted leaders forgot basic radio protocols, costing precious time. "We don't train how we fight," she said, "not if we ignore what fatigue does." The following week, command post exercises began to incorporate sleep deprivation variables. Candidates who excelled in standard drills now struggled to issue clear orders after a night without rest. Fatigue metrics gained traction at other bases. After a training accident at Fort Riley, where a rested squad failed to identify friendly forces, Elena's analysis revealed that the soldiers had just completed a 12-hour evaluation, precisely the scenario her system sought to address. Within 2 months, a memo required all field exercises to include realistic cognitive load modeling. Her methods spread informally at first. An instructor at Fort Hood requested her grading rubrics after seeing improvements in a cousin's performance. A sergeant major at Bragg borrowed copies of her sleep deprivation study to justify shifting range times. By the time Training and Doctrine Command took notice, 3 major installations had already adopted elements of her protocols. The most controversial change came with the requirement that candidates log every hour awake before evaluation. When a colonel tried to waive this rule for select officers, Elena produced data showing that rest disparities skewed results. Her analysis revealed a pattern. Well-connected candidates were tested during optimal hours, while others faced exhaustion. This led to a new policy standardizing rest periods before major assessments. Medical staff initially resisted, questioning the value of recreating combat fatigue. Elena presented casualty reports from her own ambush, showing that 68% of preventable errors occurred when personnel had exceeded recommended wake times. Her simulations mirrored these conditions. A trauma surgeon from Walter Reed eventually endorsed her approach, noting the alignment with findings from civilian trauma centers. A breakthrough came when Fort Polk's rotation center integrated Elena's metrics into their opposing force exercises. Observer controllers began rating units not only on mission success, but also on how their decision quality changed under sustained stress. The 1st Brigade to complete this evaluation saw a 31% improvement in after-dark engagement outcomes, with after-action reports crediting stress inoculation protocols. Logistical concerns surfaced last. At Benning, a facilities manager argued that sleep deprivation exercises required more barracks space. Elena resolved this by having candidates bivouac in training areas, which also increased adaptability and cut water and electricity usage by 17%. 6 months in, a Pentagon review found that 12 installations had adopted the stress assessment model, showing a 22% reduction in safety incidents during extended exercises. TRADOC standardized the approach, though their version softened the most rigorous fatigue requirements. Candidates recognized the authenticity of the new system. One lieutenant wrote that the exhaustion felt more honest than scripted drills. His platoon sergeant agreed, saying the training matched the confusion and pressure of real combat. Support staff tracked the results. Weapons maintenance logs showed a 40% drop in negligent discharges among units trained under the new protocols. The armory custodian noted that properly trained, exhausted soldiers made fewer mistakes than well-rested ones who lacked preparation. Elena continued to refine her data. Her latest metric measured how long candidates sustained situational awareness during repetitive tasks, a lesson drawn from the ambush, when she alone recognized threat patterns others missed. The first group scored 58% higher on peripheral threat detection than those trained under the old system. 3 bases now require this assessment for all advanced courses, referencing validated cognitive endurance models. At her desk, Elena kept a running tally of installations using her protocols, each checkmark a quiet record of change. On a Tuesday morning, as she reviewed the latest adoption notice, a new message appeared in her inbox, the sender's name catching her attention before she could move on to the next task. Colonel Meek's name in Elena's inbox was unexpected. She hesitated, then opened the message. He wrote from a civilian address now, his tone formal but direct. The subject line, "Apology long overdue," set the tone. Meeks admitted he'd been following the spread of her stress leadership protocols across Army training programs. He described sitting quietly at Fort Benning, watching instructors teach what they now called the Vasquez principle, emphasizing decision-making under fatigue instead of quick, rehearsed responses. He recognized her words from the transfer request he'd once denied. They met at a diner outside the base, the kind with chipped mugs and a constant hum from the fluorescent lights. Meeks looked older, less certain, his posture relaxed in civilian clothes. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, he slid a worn evaluation report across the table, his own from Ranger School, decades earlier. The comments marked him as overly cautious, lacking the aggressive traits the Army prized. Elena saw the irony immediately. Meeks traced the signature at the bottom, recalling how the same officer who'd written him off later became division commander. "I spent years trying to prove them wrong," he said quietly. "Then I turned around and did the same to you." He spoke about his early years as a junior officer, how his insistence on planning and redundant supply lines had kept his company safe in Kosovo. Yet, the official commendation was buried beneath a note about lacking command presence. He'd been passed over for battalion command more than once, always with the same feedback too reserved, not forceful enough. Eventually, he learned to mimic the expected style, trading authenticity for advancement. I became what I thought they wanted, he admitted, and lost sight of why I started. Meeks handed over a thumb drive filled with promotion board notes he'd collected over a decade. The files revealed a pattern. Candidates who excelled under stress or showed meticulous planning were consistently rated lower than those who displayed outward confidence, even if their performance in the field was weaker. Elena compared his data to her own research. The overlap was unmistakable. The Army's system repeatedly undervalued the very qualities that mattered most in crisis. They spent weeks assembling a joint paper, working late in Elena's office. Meeks insisted on listing both their names. The draft, Institutional Bias in Leadership Evaluation, a case for stress-based assessment, combined his historical data with her recent results. Peer review was slow and contentious. Some reviewers accused them of undermining tradition. Others demanded that Meeks' promotion board excerpts be removed. In the end, the journal published a version that retained the data but softened the critique. On publication day, Meeks delivered a printed copy to Elena, marked with a note. For the next one, he attached his own Kosovo evaluation, highlighting the section on planning under stress. The paper drew little official reaction at first. A few senior officers dismissed it, but at the annual Sergeant Major's conference, several leaders cited their findings. One repeated Meeks's line, "We train for war, then promote for parade." Meeks began guest lecturing in Elena's classes, focusing on surviving institutional bias. He spoke plainly about his own failures and the cost of adapting to fit a broken system. The cadets listened, not just for the stories, but for the practical advice. Adapt, he told them, but know who you're adapting for. Their collaboration continued as the Pentagon began looking into evaluation reform. Meeks endorsed Elena to lead a new research effort, crediting her for documenting what he'd only suspected. The resulting report drew heavily from her protocols and his background data. Meeks became a steady advocate for change. He testified before Congress, using Elena's research to argue for promotion system reform. When challenged about his motives, he replied, "This isn't about my career. It's about who we keep losing." Elena kept a framed copy of their original, uncensored draft in her office, alongside her own earliest evaluations, a quiet reminder of what it took to shift the system. In the spring, the Armory custodian, now retired, stopped by during a campus visit. He found Meeks and Elena reviewing new protocols side by side. "Didn't expect to see you two working together," he said. Meeks just nodded, tapping the edge of the published paper. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to see what's worth fighting for." Their work didn't draw headlines, but it changed the conversation. As the next round of readiness reports began to circulate, the impact of their efforts started to show in the numbers. Patterns emerged in the numbers long before most people noticed the change. The latest readiness data, compiled by analysts across multiple bases, didn't just track survival rates or marksmanship scores. It broke down every variable: leadership style under pressure, decision quality after fatigue, and the subtle difference between a hasty order and a measured call. In the margin of one report, a psychologist had circled the phrase, "Quiet planners outperform," linking it to the new protocols that now shaped officer selection. Elena sat in her office, reviewing the data sets that once would have disqualified her. The same descriptors, collaborative, reserved, low confrontation, now appeared as preferred traits on candidate profiles. It hadn't happened overnight. Months of field trials, paired with after-action reviews, forced the institution to recognize what the raw figures made clear. The leaders who paused to double-check windage or asked follow-up questions in a briefing were the ones whose teams came home intact. At the sniper school in Quantico, the shift became impossible to ignore. Timed shooting drills gave way to scenarios that demanded restraint. Instructors watched as candidates waited for the right shot, sometimes letting the clock run out rather than risk a mistake. The first class trained under the new system posted a dramatic drop in collateral damage and saw a surge in mission completion rates. The phrase, adaptive precision, started to show up in lesson plans, even if the official manual still called it something else. The data also forced a second look at psychological screening. The same evaluation that once branded Elena as unsuitable for command was now used as a case study in selection boards. A researcher presented brain scans showing how different leadership styles responded to stress. Those who scored high on patience and adaptability activated the parts of the brain linked to complex problem solving, while impulsive types showed a spike in areas tied to reflex and aggression. The implication was hard to ignore. As word spread, the effects rippled outward. Promotion boards received new instructions to reconsider past evaluations, especially for officers previously marked down for being too analytical or not assertive enough. One major, who'd been dropped from Ranger School for lacking aggression, found himself tapped for a strategic planning team after his profile was recoded. The personnel system, once rigid, started flagging quiet, methodical soldiers for advanced training instead of sidelining them. Small changes signaled the shift in culture. Range officers began awarding points for tactical patience. Drill sergeants encouraged recruits to explain their choices rather than simply execute orders. The armory custodian, working the range part-time, noticed more soldiers studying wind charts and dope books instead of rushing through their qualifying rounds. Where hesitation once drew ridicule, it now earned a nod of approval. Statistical proof piled up. Units trained under the new protocols saw faster casualty evacuation, improved resource management, and a sharp decline in friendly fire incidents. The numbers left little room for argument. Even critics who distrusted the reforms found themselves facing evidence they couldn't explain away. One battalion commander, initially vocal in his opposition, failed his own stress assessment and was sent to remedial training. Elena kept her own records, filling notebooks with comparative charts and handwritten observations. She tracked not just survival rates, but the nuances of decision-making under pressure. Her notes were methodical, her handwriting unchanged from the early days, precise, careful, leaving nothing to chance. Recognition came in subtle ways. West Point requested her original psychological evaluation for use in leadership seminars. Cadets were assigned to analyze it, comparing her profile with historical case studies of command decisions. Instructors who once lectured on command presence shifted their focus to the value of preparation and measured response. Elena's old evaluation, once stamped unsatisfactory, now hung in the training center lobby, the mark crossed out and replaced with a simple note. Below it, a printout of improved survival statistics caught the eye of visiting officers. The message was clear to anyone who looked closely. The data doesn't lie. As the year drew to a close, Elena spent her evenings updating the last pages of her journal. The final entry listed the survival gains by unit, with a single line beneath. Data doesn't lie. People do, until the numbers force them to change. She closed the notebook and filed it in the center archives, ready for whatever came next. The focus shifted from numbers to people as the next gathering approached, the setting all too familiar. Elena's promotion ceremony took place in the same briefing room where she'd been questioned about her leadership style years earlier. The rows of plastic chairs filled slowly, some occupied by officers who'd once dismissed her, others by soldiers who'd seen her work up close. Two generals sat at the front. Both had resisted her evaluation reforms until the numbers forced their hands. The morning sun cut through the dusty windows, casting pale lines across the floor. She stood at parade rest as the presiding officer read her new orders. The oak leaves on her shoulders felt out of place, almost understated beside the Distinguished Service Cross already pinned above her pocket. When the general reached the official line, by order of the president, Elena answered with a steady, "Yes, sir," her voice even, the same as it had been during routine inspections. The speech was brief. Elena accepted the microphone with little ceremony. "4 years ago, a paperwork error brought me here," she said, her gaze fixed ahead. "Tomorrow, someone else will arrive by accident. This time, we'll actually see what they can do." She gave 3 examples from her notebook: the quarry extraction, the night navigation, the survival rates after the ambush. Each fact came with a page number. No embellishment, just the record as it stood. A staff sergeant from S1 brought in a shadow box. Inside, Elena's original transfer orders, circled in red where the clerk had made the mistake. Someone had added a note. Best error this command ever made. The display would hang outside the brigade commander's office, a reminder to everyone passing through. After the official handshakes, Elena stepped outside and found Corporal Dawes waiting. He handed her a rifle case, the same model she'd been issued at her first post, now polished and repaired. Thought you'd need something for those, he said, glancing at her new insignia. Inside the case, 5 blank notebooks waited, each stamped as approved tactical reference. Dawes' gesture was quiet, but Elena understood its weight. The reception was subdued standard mess hall food, dry cake, bitter coffee. The catering sergeant added a protein bar on a tray, identical to the one Elena had used as a decoy during the ambush. The room laughed when Colonel Haskins tried it and declared, "Tastes like victory." For a moment, the tension eased. In her new office, Elena found the walls already decorated. Someone had mounted both her psychological evaluations and marked low aggression, the other stress leadership prototype. Below them, an index card with her first range scores, the numbers proving she'd outshot most of her critics from the start. Her first act as major was administrative, not ceremonial. She denied a transfer request from Lieutenant Grayson, citing falsified after-action reports and attaching surveillance footage as evidence. The memo went to the Inspector General as required. Word spread quickly. Soldiers who'd once mocked her now asked for copies of her field notes. The supply sergeant, who'd once shorted her on gear, delivered a case of premium notebooks to her office without a requisition slip. That evening, Elena walked the perimeter as she had so many times before. The guard posts now displayed her terrain analysis diagrams, laminated and mounted for new recruits to study. Near the motor pool, 2 privates practiced her hand signals. She corrected their technique, then moved on without a word. At the next morning's formation, the battalion commander announced changes to evaluation criteria, crediting Elena's stress leadership data. Officers glanced her way, some calculating, others simply acknowledging that the standard had shifted. Those who adapted carried notebooks. Others would have to learn. Elena's original transfer mistake became a case study. The clerk responsible had been reassigned to personnel management training, his error now used as an example of how the system sometimes uncovered overlooked talent. At the academy, cadets read about the incident as part of their coursework on leadership evaluation. Her final journal entry as captain listed the changes since the ambush: revised safety protocols, increased cash placement, officers reassigned based on stress test results. She ended the page with a single line: data manifests when institutions finally look. The framed transfer orders became a landmark outside the command suite. Visiting officers paused to read the paperwork that changed doctrine. New majors touched the glass for luck, though Elena herself never relied on superstition, only on preparation. At the armory, the custodian logged her ceremonial pistol, pausing to straighten the oak leaves on her name tape before storing it. The gesture was small and unspoken, but it marked a recognition earned over years, not days. Routine continued. Improvements layered one atop another. Elena's notebooks filled quietly, line by line, until the next challenge arrived, this time in the hands of someone new. Legacy training at OCS started quietly. The first cadet assigned to study Elena's journal expected a dry manual, but found sketches of terrain, wind calculations for tired shooters, and margin notes about how fatigue distorts perception. The observations weren't just academic. Sleep-deprived sentries miss 43% of left approach movements. They were now confirmed by Army research. Instructors pulled tactical scenarios directly from her pages, grading not on rote answers, but on how cadets adapted her solutions to new problems. What began as an assignment soon turned into late-night study sessions, with worn copies of the journal passed around after lights out. The Adaptive Precision Field Manual, based on her methods, changed how equipment was ordered. Quartermasters at Benning noticed a spike in requests for topographic protractors after cadets read about Elena's lunar navigation techniques. Her quarry ambush diagrams led to laminated cheat sheets, marked with key terrain points, circulating through the ranks. Graduates arrived at their first assignments, already fluent in what became known as the Vasquez Twister way of stabilizing wounded soldiers during movement, now standard in field manuals. Awards shifted as well. The most likely to save your ass ribbons started as a joke, but became a fixture after instructors reviewed footage of the first recipient dragging two injured cadets through a smoke-filled building using Elena's hand. Signal. Protocols. The ribbon's designer notebook and compass rose mirrored the cover of Elena's original journal. The award itself became a point of pride, not for speed or bravado, but for the kind of competence that kept people alive under stress. On the range, old habits faded. Instead of racing through drills, cadets paused to check wind flags, accepting point penalties, but earning quiet approval from instructors. The change traced back to Elena's graph on shot dispersion and heart rate under stress. Now, range scores were withheld until each candidate explained their decisions, with accuracy and reasoning valued above reflex. Medical and evacuation exercises incorporated fatigue as a variable. Cadets performed triage after hours awake, referencing Elena's ambush logs. Her method of reorganizing trauma kits by urgency, not alphabet, became standard. When a lieutenant colonel's daughter survived a training accident because a cadet used Elena's splinting technique, resistance to the new approach faded. Mess hall talk changed. Cadets debated cache placement strategies, tested each other's ability to hide supplies, and navigated blindfolded using Elena's stellar drift calculations. The unofficial Vasquez challenger finding hidden supplies with only her notebook as a guide became a rite of passage. Equipment rooms followed suit. Medical shears, backup iron sights, and even the flat bootlaces Elena preferred became standard issue. Armorers maintained a vintage M4, matching the serial number of her rifle from the ambush, a nod to the story behind the changes. Recognition often went to those who least expected it. Cadet Nguyen, who had learned terrain analysis from her father, completed the final course without penalties by following Elena's advice about secondary kill zones. At graduation, Nguyen's speech echoed Elena's journal. Quiet competence rings louder when systems finally listen. Her solution maps, nearly identical to Elena's, were displayed beside the originals. Replica ambush sites, built from Elena's diagrams, forced cadets to apply her methods under realistic conditions. Instructors simulated fatigue before evaluations, citing her research on decision decay. The results were clear: training injuries dropped, and response times improved. The journal's last pages became required memorization. Cadets recited Elena's warnings about institutional bias and carried pocket notebooks with tabs matching her organizational system. After graduation, requests for journal copies spiked, not just for tactics, but for the margin notes that reminded soldiers perseverance mattered. Night rotations now included Vasquez drill soon announced scenarios during circadian lows. Cadets faced comms failures and medical emergencies in strobe-lit chaos, using tactics drawn from Elena's most controversial entry: train for reality, not for parades. Early skeptics changed their minds after the first class rescued pinned-down rangers during a joint exercise, using her methods. The award plaque simply read, "For those who notice." It hung beside Elena's original evaluation in the commandant's hallway, close to survival statistics. Generals sometimes paused at the display, recognizing their own signatures on outdated forms nearby. A few quietly requested journal copies afterward. Maintenance logs told the rest. The ribbon required frequent polishing from cadets handling it for luck. First edition journals, their pages stiff from use, now sat behind glass. In armories, one rifle always stood apart, preserved as a reminder of the legacy that reshaped training. As new cohorts cycled through, the effects of these changes began to reach beyond the classroom. The patterns of adaptation, once isolated, started to appear across branches, setting the stage for broader shifts no one had fully anticipated. Change in the military rarely announces itself. At Fort Kellen, it started with a handful of instructors quietly revising their scorecards. The old system rewarded speed and volume: how quickly a recruit could fire, how loudly they could call out orders. But as Rachel Martinez's results filtered through the ranks, those metrics started to lose weight. Her marksmanship program, once doubted for its slower pace, produced candidates who rarely missed under pressure. The numbers told a story. Collateral damage incidents dropped, and first shot accuracy soared, even if target acquisition times crept up by seconds. The lesson was clear precision, and judgment saved lives in ways that raw speed never could. Colonel Chen recognized the implications before most. She watched Martinez in the armory, methodically checking each rifle, and saw a kind of focus that didn't fit the old mold. Chen's review of the sniper school's data exposed a consistent flaw. Top scorers in timed drills often failed when stress and fatigue set in. That finding triggered a review not just of training, but of how leaders were chosen. Boards that once prized aggression over thoughtfulness began to include tests at the lowest points of the circadian cycle, evaluating who could still make sound decisions at 3 a.m., not just at midday. This shift rippled outward. Drill sergeants started to note which recruits asked for clarification during briefings, or who paused to check windage despite the pressure to move on. Range officers tracked tactical patience, awarding points for double-checking calculations. What used to be labeled hesitation now became a mark of discipline. The results were immediate. Units trained under the new protocols evacuated casualties faster and wasted less ammunition. Complaint filings over unfair evaluation dropped, and retention among previously marginalized recruits climbed sharply. The impact went beyond numbers. Soldiers who once left the service, those written off for lacking the so-called warrior presenzo, found a place. The 80th Airborne saw retention among low-aggression profile troops nearly triple. These soldiers brought skills often overlooked: acute terrain analysis, crisis medicine, and the ability to maintain composure when the plan fell apart. Performance reviews for officers shifted as well. Those previously labeled too cerebral or not assertive enough began to fill strategic planning posts. One major, previously failed for lacking aggression, now led a counterinsurgency cell with far fewer casualties than his peers. Even equipment requests reflected the new priorities. Quartermasters noticed a spike in orders for topographical protractors, ballistic calculators, and durable flat boot lacestes, kinds Martinez had recommended after her own field experience. Medical kits expanded to include supplies for prolonged care, mirroring the adjustments she'd made after the ambush at Fort Kellen. Small changes in gear signaled a larger change in mindset. Training accidents, too, declined. The infantry school reported a significant drop in injuries after adding fatigue awareness modules. Cadets learned to recognize when their own judgment slipped and practiced self-assessment in conditions that mimicked real exhaustion. Instructors no longer avoided sleep deprivation. They used it as a tool, teaching cadets to recognize and compensate for decision decay. Psychological resilience became part of the curriculum. PTSD rates fell among units trained with stress inoculation and coping strategies Martinez had once scribbled in her notebook. Soldiers reported relying on these techniques during extended operations, crediting their ability to stay focused and recover after setbacks. Colonel Chen's final report made the case plain. The most adaptable soldiers weren't the loudest or the fastest, but those who combined technical skill with flexibility and patience. Their evaluations reflected traits once considered liabilities: collaboration, emotional regulation, and what Martinez called situational patience. These qualities, previously overlooked, now predicted long-term success. Legacy programs cemented the new approach. West Point incorporated Martinez's journals into leadership coursework, and the Most Likely to Save Your Ass award became a coveted honor. First won by a logistics specialist who credited Martinez's notes for saving her team during an urban drill. These details, once considered minor, now shaped the culture. 5 years after the reforms began, the numbers left little doubt. Retention rates for non-traditional recruits tripled. Complaints about unfair evaluation dropped by more than half. Most telling, the majority of soldiers now believed they were judged on what actually mattered. The culture had shifted, not through a single order, but through quiet, persistent change: one notebook, one revised scorecard, one act of patience at a time. The proof, for anyone willing to see it, lay in the records, and the results waiting for the next leader to recognize what had changed. A final image appears. Elena's original psychological evaluation, now marked Prototype for Modern Leader. Alongside it, statistics. Scroll quiet leaders, outperforming traditional types in crisis by a significant margin, with far fewer friendly fire incidents. The camera pauses on her journal's margin note. Document everything. Even minor wins accumulate. A sequence follows. Cadets pore over her annotated terrain sketches, sergeants demonstrate her hand signals, medics apply her triage protocols during drills. The last frame shows updated retention rates for recruits who once didn't fit the mold. The screen fades to black. White text lingers. Which quiet strength will history notice next? The only sound is a pencil on paper as the credits begin.